Yankee Workshop. During a visit to Nantucket last summer, I spied a very interesting piece of furniture. Now, it was in one of the great old houses, and it wasn't exactly a linen press, and it wasn't exactly a cupboard. It was a little of each, so I've called it a press cupboard. It was in the dining room. They were using it to store linens, serving dishes, and silverware. And best of all, it was made out of antique pine, and we know how to do that. I'll show you next right here in the new Yankee Workshop.
The new Yankee Workshop features the craftsmanship of Norm Abram and is made possible by
Porter Cable, building performance and innovation into woodworking tools since 1906. Available through woodworking dealers, hardware stores, and home centers everywhere. Porter Cable, the woodworker's choice.
Minwax. For over 90 years, we've made a complete line of interior stains, protective finishes, and wood care products designed to turn your house into a beautiful home. Minwax makes and keeps wood beautiful.
and by
Delta Woodworking Machinery. A full line of precision shop tools available at woodworking dealers, hardware stores, and home centers. Delta, building on tradition.
Well, our supply of antique pine timbers is down to just a few boards. But I did have enough stock for today's project. I've already reconditioned some of the pieces. Here are the boards that I'm going to use for the back. Here's a couple boards that I glued together to make one of the sides. The other side will actually be a single width board. Here are 3 glue-ups for the shelves. These pieces will be cut into the rails and stiles for the door, and these pieces will make the panels for our door. I also glued some thicker stock together so that I can turn the legs. Now, if you'd like to build our press cupboard, a measure drawing is available with a materials list, and you'll hear more about that before the program ends. There's one more board to recondition, this one right here, which will be the top of the cupboard. Look at this. It's over 21 inches wide, and it's well over an inch thick. Now, one of the problems we have with these old timbers is that they're often cupped, and they get a check or a crack in them. I suppose you could cut it in half, but one thing I tried to do here is to keep it in one piece. So I flattened it out, and then I filled the crack with a urethane glue, which is sort of like foam. It expands. And now the board is nice and flat, and it's securely held together. I still want to remove the paint and make it flat, and for that I'm going to use my wide belt sander. Now, the sander has been set up with the coarsest grit paper I have, which is 36 grit. And I've set the height to just take a little bit off. I don't want to take off too much in a pass. But before we use any power tools, let's take a moment to talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. Well, that's as far as I want to do with that 36 grit. If I go too far, my glue will start to show through, and I don't want to take away the nice color that I have. But I want to smooth it up, so now I'll go to 80 grit. All right, well, that takes care of that. Nice and smooth and uniform in thickness. Now I just have to size it. The first step in sizing any panel is to get one edge straight and square, and that's what I just did at the joiner. The next step is to place that edge against the rip fence and rip the panel about 1/16 of an inch wider than what I need. Now, one more pass over the joiner will clean up that crusty sawn edge. The next step is to square it up and cut it to length. So first I turn to my panel cutter, just a big piece of plywood with a runner on the bottom and a fence across the front. Rides in the miter slot of the saw. Simply set the piece against the fence and trim off one end. With that end square and with the fence set to the right length, slide the squared end against the fence and run it through for length. The dado that I've just made in the side panels will receive a dust frame, which is going to support that drawer. Now, the next dado will be down here at the bottom, and that'll have the fixed shelf in it. All I have to do is readjust my fence. Okay, now I'm going to set up to make a rabbet along the back edge of each side panel. What I'm doing here is installing a sacrificial wood strip onto my metal rip fence. If I was to slide the fence up against the dado head, I'd damage the saw. Here I'm forming some grooves in some pieces of plywood for that dust frame we mentioned earlier. Now, the groove serves two purposes. It'll receive a piece of plywood to keep things from falling from the drawer bottom into the cabinet, and then I'll form tenons on these rails which will connect the pieces together, and they fit into that groove. Now, to make sure that the piece stays tightly up against the fence, I've taken the precaution of installing this featherboard. Another important tip is that when I run it through, even though the blade is almost perfectly centered, I flip it around and make another pass, and that guarantees that it'll be centered. Now I'm beginning to form the tenons on the cross pieces. I have a scrap piece of stock, and by eye I've just made a few passes through the dado head to see if I can get a nice fit. Now, you notice I always make the grooves first, then the tenons. It's easier to fit the tenon to the groove than it is to fit the groove to the tenon. Now, that's still a little snug, so I'm going to raise the blade up a bit and give it another try. Okay, that's good. That's a nice slip fit. Now I'll adjust the fence for the length of the tenon, and I can run all the pieces through. Now, for the assembly of the dust frame, I put glue on the tenon and in the groove. And just slip it together like that. Okay, now for the plywood, it just slips in, no glue here, and the other side. Now, the glue will really do the job to hold all the pieces together. What I'm going to do once it's assembled is put it in a set of clamps to squeeze the joints tight and then pin them with a couple brads. Here I have the top for our cupboard with the bottom side facing up, and I've laid out the exact width of the cupboard, these two lines right here. The objective is to cut a dado along that line, which will stop right here so it won't show through the front. To make that dado, I'm going to use my router, which I've set up with a 3/4 inch straight cutting bit. Here I've simply switched to a longer straight edge clamp to create a rabbet along the back edge into which the backboards will fit. Here I'm forming a series of evenly spaced holes in the side panel for these clips which will support the adjustable shelves. I have a homemade jig, which is just a piece of 1/2 inch plywood that I've clamped to the side piece, and the holes in the jig match the diameter of this collar. In the router, I've installed this 1/4 inch straight cutting bit, and that makes the hole for the pin. Here I'm making some grooves in some 5/8 inch boards, which are going to be the back of our cupboard. The setup that I'm using is similar to the one that I used to make the grooves in our dust frames. The setup to form the tongue along the edge of each backboard is similar to the setup that I used to form the tenons for that dust frame. However, now I've installed a featherboard to keep the stock tight to the table since I'm running along the length. Often in these old pieces, you'll see where the woodworker has put a slight bevel where the boards meet, and that gives the effect of a V-groove. As I begin to assemble the carcass, the first piece to go in is the dust frame. And that just gets a little bit of glue in the groove, set the frame in place, check to see that it's square, and then toenail some brads through. And there's the bottom shelf in place. Now with glue in the other side piece, I'll just flip the whole assembly around, drop it into the dados, and secure it with a few more brads. With glue in the dados of our top, I can slide the partially assembled carcass into position, drop it down, flush it up on the back, and nail it in place. The first of the 5/8" thick boards that make up the back has to have the groove ripped off so that I have something to nail through. And I like to leave a little bit of space because these boards will move a bit with changes in humidity. Now I'm going to secure them with some brads into the top, the bottom shelf, and the dust frame. With the carcass on its back, I've just used my back saw to notch the bottom shelf. And that's necessary so that the face frame style can run by. This glue roller does a nice job putting down a nice even coat of glue along the side. Now I just take my style, set it in place, and secure it with some 1.5" brads. Now this narrow strip of pine is a rail, and it covers the edge grain of the dust frame. When I saw this piece in Nantucket, it sits up on legs. Now the back legs are not seen, so they're just simple square stock. But I need a notch so that it'll wrap around the side. To make that notch, I'm just going to use my table saw. I've set the height at the right place, and I've set the fence for the other edge of the notch. I'll start on the end and nibble away until I hit the fence. Now a good coat of glue on all the places that it meets the cabinet. Set it in place and drive a couple brads through that bottom shelf. The front legs are a little different. They're a turning that I'll make at the lathe later. But I need this spacer block to bring it down flush to the face frame and the side, and I need to make a notch to fit around the style. So I'll make that notch over at my bandsaw. Okay, that's going to be fine. Now some more glue, and I'll secure this with a couple more brads. Okay, well that does it for today. Now tomorrow we'll take this blank and turn a couple feet for the front, and then we'll make some doors and a drawer. Well, good morning. Last night, all the glue set up on those face frame parts that I installed, and this morning I've taken the time to sand everything nice and flush along the side and then knock the corners off so it'll be ready for the finishing room. Now I'm ready to turn those feet. And I've been thinking about how I'm going to use this blank. Instead of turning the feet individually, I think I'll turn one on this end, one on this end, and then slice them off. Now what I want to do first to get started is to mark the center of the blank. And I just use this centering tool. It hooks over the edge of the piece. And that gives me the absolute center. Then I take a scratch awl and just put a little punch right on that center point. Now I could go to the lathe at this point, but I want to save myself a little bit of time. So I'm going to take these dividers or this compass and lay out the maximum diameter of the piece. Then I want to knock these corners off the table saw so that they'll save time at the lathe. I'm going to turn the feet at my variable speed lathe. And the first step is to take this drive center out. And it actually has a point in the center and 4 spurs. I set the point on the center hole and just drive it in with a mallet. And that's actually what's going to spin the piece of wood. Then I slide it back into the lathe, slide the cup center over so that it's about 1/8 inch away, lock it in place, and then turn the cup center into the piece and set it. All right, now that's good. The next thing is to test to see if it's balanced. So I'm just going to turn the lathe on, and that's pretty good. Okay, now I can slide the tool rest over, and I want that to be about 1/8 inch away from the piece and parallel, and I'll just lock that in place. Now I'm ready to start some turning. First thing I want to do is put on my full-face mask, because I'll tell you, if a piece of this wood comes flying off the lathe, you want to have this on. The first tool that I'm going to use is this gouge. And all I'm going to do is ride it along the tool rest and make the piece round. That's pretty good. Now I can do some layout. I made a sketch of the original foot with some measurements, and now I want to transfer some of these measurements over to the blank. The overall height is 3.5 inches, and there's about 1/4 of an inch of flat area, and then 1.5 inches ball. Go right about here, and right in the center there's a little bit of a ridge, so we put a couple marks right here. Now if I turn the lathe on, I can make those marks go all the way around. Okay, and what I'm going to do first is reduce this section down to a slightly smaller diameter. Now I'm going to take this parting tool, and what I'm going to do with this is make the diameter at the very bottom of the foot the exact measurement that I want. Okay, now I'm going to do the same thing on the other side of what will become the ball. Okay, now I'm going to make a very shallow cut on each side of the center marks. Okay, now I'm going to switch to a small gouge and just form the ball. Just set it on the tool rest, bring it to the piece, and then round it over. Now I want to make a few more marks at the top of the foot. I want to be 3/8 down, and then 1/2 inch, and 3/8 again. I want to turn this section to the same diameter as this section, and then put a little bit of a cove right in the middle. That's pretty good. Now I'll repeat the process on the other end. Now I can just take the blank out of the lathe, and I think that the best tools to cut them off is the bandsaw. And I'm just using my miter gauge as a guide. I'm going to attach the feet to the cabinet with these dowel screws. So I want to drill a 5/16 inch diameter pilot hole lest I split the foot. Now that takes care of the corresponding hole in the carcass. I'm just using a pair of vice grips to hold the piece while I turn it into the foot. Get it in about halfway, and then I'll just screw the whole assembly into the carcass. Okay, that's good. Now this little overhang is deliberate because there's going to be a molding that wraps around the bottom of the carcass. I spent the last few minutes setting up my router table to make our doors. And this is a sample of the edge of the door. This groove will receive the panels and the tenons from the rails. And this is just a nice bead detail. I made this in one pass using a bit from a door making set. Now that's one bit. The other bit is this one right here. And this one will allow me to cope the ends of the rails so that they'll fit into the stiles. Now I've just run a piece of scrap stock through along the length. I need this piece as a backer when I make the tenons on the rails. Now I'm going to install my shaper jig. And this is a useful tool when you form these tenons because you have to hold the piece. We're going across the end grain, which is tough. Now this is the backer piece that I just made. You lock that in place. Here's a scrap with the bead and groove already cut in it. And you can see that that just slides in right up against that backer piece. And what that'll do is help prevent tear out when the bit comes through the back edge. Lock it down. I've raised the bit up to compensate for the thickness of this plate, and we'll run a sample. Now what I'm going to do is change the backer. For the opposing tenon, all I need is a piece of square stock because there's no groove on that side of the rail. So it just sits tight up against that. Okay, that takes care of the rails. This is the piece of stock that I'm going to use to make the panel for the door. I want to show a flat panel on the outside. Now I could use a piece of 1/4 inch stock that would fit perfectly in those grooves, but that makes for a flimsy panel. So I'm using some 3/4 inch stock, and what I'm going to do is raise the panel to get it down to a thin edge. I'll show the raised portion on the inside of the door. You would frequently see this in old pieces. Now, To raise it, I'm using my panel raising bit. Well, let's fit this door frame together. A little bit of glue on the tenons of the rail pieces. And I've already put some glue in the grooves of the stiles. I'll just drop this piece in first. And I think I'll set my panel in next. There's no glue on the panel. It just floats in those grooves. And now we'll just clamp it. Here are the pieces that I need for my drawer for the cupboard. I've just made a 1/4 inch wide groove that will receive the plywood bottom. I need that groove in the sides and in the front. Now that 1/2 inch wide dado, the back edge of the side piece, receives the back of my drawer. The sides of my drawer is a joint to the front with dovetail joinery, and that's what I'm doing here. This is my dovetailing jig. It has adjustable fingers that give me any dovetail layout as well as any height of drawer. This first step is to cut the pins in the side pieces. All I do is use the router, which has a collar and a dovetailing bit, and simply follow the fingers on the jig. I've made a couple adjustments to my jig and installed the drawer front in the top of it, and now I'm ready to cut the pins. Now, as I've told you before, the thing that makes this joint so strong is the shape of the joint and all the glue surfaces. I could use plywood to build these drawer sides, but I really like using this antique pine. It makes the piece look more authentic. With the bottom slit in place, just run a row of brads right along the back edge. There are a couple pieces of 3/4 by 3/4 stock that will guide the side of the drawer so that it'll go straight in the opening. Okay, now let's see if this drawer is going to fit. That's good. Now we'll make the molding for the bottom. I'm going to make the molding using 2 router bits. The first one is a rabbiting bit. Now I've switched to a cove bit. Let me show you what that'll do. It'll take 2 passes to give me the result I want. Now a little hand work to sweeten it up here and there. Okay, you can see how this molding dresses up the front edge and covers that overlap on the leg. Well, there it is in the rough. Now, before I put the hinges on or any knobs, I think we'll bring it into the finishing room. Well, the best finish that we've found for this antique pine is a stained polyurethane combination called honey pine. The reason we like it is because it really brings out the beauty of the wood, and it makes the wood look very much like those antique waxed pieces that you see. But the difference between wax and this is that this is going to protect the wood a lot better. I'll put on 1 coat, let it dry for 8 hours, give it a light sanding, put on another coat, and that should do the job. Here's our press cupboard with a couple coats of that stained polyurethane. I've installed some pine knobs on the drawer and on the doors. I mortised in some brass cabinet hinges, installed a couple magnetic catches up here at the top where they really won't be seen, and dropped in the adjustable shelves. What I really like about this piece is that it's sized for today's living. And if there's any tip that I have, the only way you can get this nice old look is to use antique pine timbers. You just can't do it with new lumber. This is a very useful project.